Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to, wow, it's the end of the year. It's amazing how this year has actually flown by, and I think you, if I'm correct, are also, like most of us, literally counting down last lecture, last tut, last assignment, Okay, well, I sincerely hope that you have a fantastic summer, which hopefully is about to happen. But today we're going to actually discuss and revise and go through a little bit of the introduction to the concepts around contract, and particularly when we're talking about what makes a legal agreement. Now, if you remember, we actually initially discussed this, and it was about that issue around consensus. But prior to and before we actually even get to a traditional contract setting that we normally see within business or operations, or even in terms of specific contracts like sale or lease, prior to all of this is the fact that there must be a valid offer and a valid acceptance. Now, in terms of offer and acceptance, in the two fundamental concepts here must be the fact that we as parties, both, a minimum of two, must agree, and there must be a clear understanding as to what it is that we're actually agreeing to. And then pivotal to this is the fact that, and you'll even find this in American courtroom television, is that when they discuss the ideas about contract, and even UK, if you watch Judge Rinder, is the fact that you must actually have a legal intention to seriously be bound by this particular agreement. In other words, that you have an intention to be bound by the obligations that you've created. So tying directly into this is the idea of offer and acceptance. Now, we do this on a daily basis. If you're walking into Woolworths and you're going to buy some water, at what point was the offer actually made to you? At what point did you actually accept to buy that water at that particular price? Sorry, yes? Prior to that, if you're walking in, if you practically walk into a store and you're walking into any particular shop, it doesn't have to be Woolworths, it could be Checkers, it could be Shop, it could be anything. You're looking for something called the price, aren't you? So, and that's part of why it is that you make a particular determination if you're going to buy this particular good or this particular service at that particular price. So that's part of what we're talking about. In terms of this, it's not like we then negotiate and you pick up that water and you arrive at the till and then say, well, I really want the water, but I think that 15 Rand was a little bit much, don't you? I'm willing to offer you 10 Rand. That doesn't happen in that particular transaction. So here I'm talking about the fact that somebody has made a valid offer, and then whether or not you've actually accepted that particular offer. Once that is actually complete, we can now start entering into this particular contract as we would understand it. So here, particularly, it's important we see that it's created, both parties are then bound, and then have to perform. Performance being a very important contractual term in this context. So, when you make an offer, the parties include the offeror and the offeree, and the offer is basically that which actually declares to the offeree that it has, or he or she has, a particular intention to enter into a particular contract based on some particular specified terms and conditions. So, when you actually accept it, I, as the person accepting, or the offeree, actually then imply and expressly state, all through conduct, state that I am actually agreeing to be bound by the offer as it has been put to me. If there are particular terms and conditions, then I agree to be bound by those as well. So we would normally see, particularly if a contract has been reduced in writing, that we would actually see a particular date, a particular time, a particular place where the contract was concluded. Why that is obviously going to be important is what happens if we have disagreements? What happens if there is some sort of conflict? Then we want to know, when was a contract concluded? When did we agree to be bound by it? What did we agree to be bound by? And more importantly is, where is that conflict going to be resolved? Is it going to be in P, Grahamstown, or Cape Town? And that often will determine is determined by where the contract may be concluded. Interestingly enough, 21st century, how are contracts concluded? The general rule is that it's created when and where the offer is, as offeror, is actually informed, in other words, that the other person has agreed that they want to be bound by that particular contract. This is the fundamental rule, we call that the information theory. Following that, however, it becomes far more interesting in the fact that we obviously also discuss the fact that contracts can be accepted telephonically. Whoever still uses faxes. What about postal contracts? What happens if I post my acceptance? And what happens if I send an email? So we have various methods to determine how that can possibly be concluded. What is important, however, for this to have been complete, it must actually include the idea that I have actually accepted that particular offer. And that acceptance must be clear. In other words, it cannot be seen to be somehow vague or ambiguous. In contract, we can actually say that a particular contract may not be enforceable because it is void for vagueness. So that could be an unintended consequence. It must also be particularly implicit that what you intend is not actually simply for humor. So in other words, if you had entered into an agreement, I'm not saying contract, an agreement with a friend, and you say, well, if neither of us are married by the time that we are 40 years old, whoever turns 40 first has to actually contact the other person and we will then get married. Is that legally enforceable? No. Because what was the intention in that particular instance? Was it really your intention to be bound by something like this? So be clear, there must be no ambiguity. And wherever it is that you actually communicated, whatever it is that your decision is that it must clearly be communicated to the offeree. Important here is that we want to look at whether or not that particular offer may have been rejected, revoked, or even lapsed. So in other words, all of this must be current. So when your intention to be bound by a contract has been passed on or communicated to the other particular person, it's clear then that if it's not induced, if it's not a particular joke, what about advertising? And advertising is an interesting dynamic. When you think of advertising or any particular commercial venture, do you necessarily see all adverts as being the truth? Do you think that all adverts and everything that is in a particular advertisement is fact? Or is there room for maneuver, something that we call puffery? In that particular instance, you'll obviously see examples of advertisements that want to sell a particular vehicle as being the fastest, the most efficient, dishwashing liquid that cleans like no other. Is it necessarily going to be the case? Is that particular agent going to make sure that your sheets are whiter than white? Is it going to, I think it was Doom that kills bugs dead? Those kinds of advertisements. So there's scope for this in the sense that we understand as consumers that it's not necessarily going to be scientific fact. That's why it's called an advertisement and not actually a published paper in that particular sense. But key thing about this is that an advertisement is actually not an offer per se, but it is an invitation for you to actually enter into trade with that particular business or a particular individual. So it must be clear, however, that when you are advertising or when you're publishing something, that it is actually an offer or not. So with carbolic smoke, and the interesting case here was a company that actually made a unilateral offer basically to the general public that said, if you use our product and you use it correctly as it has been prescribed, but you still fall ill, in other words, that you contract influenza, aka the flu, then we will pay each person £100. And that, in that particular instance, was seen as an offer, because there was no miscommunication, there was no suggestion that it was just purely an advertisement or marketing ploy. They actually made that very express and very clear, and they were found liable for that. The other interesting thing is what happens with rewards. And the key thing here is that this might feel slightly awkward in the sense that it might seem unfair. But with the concept of rewards, again, there must actually be a legitimate offer that was made public, and then the person that wants to claim the reward must have been aware that there was an offer and accept that. So if an offer for a reward is made available to the general public, and in this particular instance, I'm thinking of a particular example which will relate to a very well-known jewelry manufacturing company back in 1915. when American Swiss actually put out a reward saying, if anyone has any information, there will be a certain amount of money available to any member of the public that can lead to the arrest of people that are actually stolen from us. And unfortunately, a very dutifully well-meaning individual actually came forward and offered information that actually led to exactly that. Unfortunately, American Swiss turned around and said, but you weren't actually aware that there was an offer for a reward at the time. So when you gave us the information, it means that we're not legally bound to actually giving you the money that we offered. And that was also entirely enforceable. So we've also heard of auctions. I don't know how many of you have ever participated in auctions, online or otherwise. Don't know if it's something which intrigues you, but there are various methods of trading, and one of these very useful methods is through auction houses. Now, when you are discussing the issue of sale through an auction, the interesting thing about this is that it is an item which is then made available to the public, and the public then has an opportunity to bid on that particular item. The question is whether or not it is actually being sold with or without a reserve. Now, when it comes to reserve, in effect, you have a minimum which somebody has to pay, and if you don't reach that minimum, you're actually not going to sell it at auction. So I, as the seller, say that I want my car sold, but I believe that its inherent value is nothing less or nothing short of 100,000 Rand. I'd rather keep it and use it than actually lose less or more than that. So anything above that, and then the auctioneer is actually free to actually sell that particular item. By bidding then, you are accepting the particular offer, and then you create the particular contract. So once again, as I said, it has a minimum reserve, minimum selling price, and people make those particular bids, then they're actually making an offer which the auctioneer can then choose to either accept or reject. Okay, now with the issue of communication. Once again, as I said, the offer is communicated to the offeree. This is the issue of American Swiss. Once again, just note, this isn't about whether or not it was fair. It was whether or not the person was informed, whether or not it was communicated, and whether or not it was based on whether the person was aware that there was an offer and that person actually validly accepted it, that it's actually legally enforceable against, in this instance, American Swiss. So once again, this thing about being current, whether or not it should actually be revoked. Here the issue might be relative to a particular stipulated time, or if there's no particular stipulated time, then we look at whether or not it is within a reasonable time frame. When we see the word reasonable, we always try to think of something which is objective. So it'll depend on the circumstances in relation to that particular dynamic and that particular exchange. Practically speaking, however, there are certain times when an offer will simply lapse. So one of the easiest ones would be the last one, which is the moment I accept the offer. If I accept the offer has lapsed. It sounds almost blatantly obvious, but one of the ways in which, for example, if I can go back to the previous analogy, an engagement, if you are now going to marry that person, one of the ways in which an engagement can terminate is if you actually accept and actually choose to marry the person. The moment you're married, the engagement is over. So in the same way, the acceptance is terminated. Another practical way is if that person dies. Okay, so the requirements for a valid offer are the following. Firstly, there must be acceptance. Must be from the offeree. 2, the offeree must actually know about it. Clear and unambiguous. You must comply with any particular terms, and interestingly enough, remember we're going to come to that later with the principles of contract, is that if you as the parties agree that there must be specific terms, then those terms must be complied with. So it might be date, time, place, in writing or not, those kinds of things. And whether it's stipulated or whether it's subject to this thing called reasonable time, and it must of course be communicated. So the source, interestingly enough, is where does this come from? Is the only person to whom an offer was made can actually accept that particular offer. There is the exception if it is open to the general public. Example, like the reward. So then anyone that came forward and actually provided the information and provided it first would then actually amount to an acceptance, and then the contract of the reward would actually be enforceable against, in that instance, American Swiss. And then very importantly, again, the intention is that, of course, anyone can in this instance accept that particular offer. So this, of course, is the Bloom's case. Who here would actually, interestingly enough, have probably offered the information if there was no reward? Okay, we'll leave incentives for another day then. Okay, when it comes to the thing about clarity and this thing about being clear and unambiguous, is it ties into the concept of certainty. So we want to know from a practical perspective, if you're going to enforce, for example, something like performance against somebody else, what is it that I'm actually agreeing to? What is it that I have actually bought? So in other words, if my intention, is stick to the water, was to actually purchase water from Woolworths at a given price. If I ordered still water, but you delivered sparkling, is that what I actually ordered? Is that what I wanted? Is there then a valid agreement?
Well, it is a valid agreement if you took the water. Is that not an agreement?
I'm not now saying that I actually went in and purchased it and physically took it myself. I said, I'd like some water, please. I'm happy with the price. Let's assume it was 20 Rand a bottle. And I'd like it delivered. Now, Woolworths delivers the water to me, but they delivered sparkling water, not still.
You have the right to return it and get what you actually ordered.
Yeah, because if I actually ordered still water, this is now what we come into positive malperformance. In other words, the other contracting party did actually deliver water. Water is what I ordered. There was no disagreement on the selling price. The issue here was when it came to clarity and specificity, I ordered still water. So there was a form of positive malperformance. So I can then ask for the water to be exchanged. So I can get what it is that I ordered. To make it slightly more interesting, let's assume it wasn't water, but I was somebody who was actually severely allergic to a particular ingredient in a particular product. That could have very serious health repercussions for me. So, issue around compliance. Offeree must accept all the terms. Straightforward. If an offeree changes the particular term of the offer, technically speaking, I'm now rejecting that particular offer and I'm now making a counter offer. And that new offer now has to be accepted by that other person. Now, when it comes to timeliness, obviously, if we're talking about particular time and the stipulated or reasonable time, what you would prefer, if you wanted to be clear and specific, is to actually include a time clause. So you could say that the offer is open for a particular week, from a particular date, until a particular date, for a particular time, and these are the ways or places in which you can actually accept the offer. When it comes to form, if you decide that there must be a particular way or a form, that is now potentially a valid condition, and then as a consequence, you need to meet that particular requirement. For example, I say that all offers must be accepted only in writing. That means you must actually sign, date, and then dispatch it to that particular person for it to be enforceable. And that again ties into communication, because if it wasn't successfully communicated, then how is it going to be enforced? And then the last one is the various theories that we could obviously look at. The first one obviously was the information theory, which is the straightforward, I'm actually going to be in your particular presence. This is the one that we all hope for is the most easy and straightforward to understand. So you make a particular offer, I'm in your presence, I'm happy with that particular offer. I say, yes, I'll purchase the water at that price, and I take it and I walk out of the store. There's no dynamic about where and when it took place, because it took place at that particular time when everyone was present. The declaration theory, however, says now that it actually allows parties to the opportunity to make a particular determination as to where and when and how they actually want to conclude that. So it gives people the latitude or the freedom to be able to be more in control of how it is that they want to regulate their this aspect of the contract. When it comes to expedition, however, this now also refers to things like postal contracts. So in other words, what happens if somebody actually makes the particular offer? That person happens to be in Cape Town. You happen to be in Grahamstown. and you want to accept it. You accept the offer by actually completing the form, and you're sending the letter, and you physically post it, and you post it in Grahamstown. Where and when was the contract concluded? Was it concluded in Cape Town, or was it included in Grahamstown? According to the expedition theory. If somebody is making an offer, and the offer, let's say it's an offer of sale, and they're selling a car, and that person is in Cape Town, they're saying at 150,000 Rand, you're in Grahamstown, you want to buy the car, and then you actually send them a letter and you post it in Grahamstown, where and when was that contract concluded? Yes?
When it's posted in Grahamstown.
When and where it was posted in Grahamstown. Yes, you're 100% correct. And that's the expedition theory. That theory has then been expanded on over time, because the interesting thing now is what happens when it comes to issues around email. Where and when was a contract concluded if you accept by email? Yes?
When it's read by the when it lands in your inbox.
That's the thing, yes. It's not necessarily, because most people will think, oh, we have to wait until that person has actually read my email, and at that particular point, the contract is not actually being included because he read my acceptance. It's actually not the case. The moment you've actually clicked send, and it's no longer actually in your, well, it's in your outbox, but it's actually technically in that person's inbox, and technically speaking, it's no longer under your control as such. It's now under, it's in that etherness, that particular space where you're actually dealing with it within another server. But it's actually gone, it's been sent. You've not actually met the requirements and you've actually accepted it. You don't actually have to wait until that person has actually opened that particular email. Okay. Reception is just literally a case when it actually has been received and it's actually been addressed and it really lands on somebody else's desk. So, example here with the postal contract is basically when and where. If you look at the Cape Town versus perhaps a PE example, you'll see here that if X then posts that particular offer on the 1st of May and Y posts an acceptance on the 10th, the important thing about this is this particular date here and the place here, because X might receive it much later. Of course, in South Africa, we also had the unfortunate issue of postal strikes, and that might very seriously impact on your ability to contract. So we will look at the date and place where the actual acceptance was posted from.
Sorry.
Yes?
The email part where you said,
Yes?
say X is posting the offer. Once Y replies email into the inbox and it's accepted.
Yes. So so in other words, if you're selling me something online, and you said that I'm going to send, my response and I'm going to try and contact you in exactly the same way, because that will apply to things like WhatsApps, that will apply to me leaving some sort of voice note, that would apply to me actually leaving a message on an answering machine. I don't know if you still have answering machines. Then it's not about the fact that I have to wait until the other person has literally heard it, and then done something positive as a consequence of me sending it. The moment I've actually sent it on, that means I've already accepted it. Okay. So there under the information theory illustrated in this particular point, it would obviously be in line with the general principle conclusion of when and where and how, where this person actually hears it. When it comes to expedition, here this is not the illustration of our actual postal service in terms of concluding postal contracts. Here, acceptance is posted to hopefully the correct address. These are the practicalities we might have to look at. And then, of course, it implies that the postal service is actually working. Okay, but basically this should be and is an entirely valid form of acceptance. When it comes to revoking it, this is where the expedition theory will become more practically applicable, because you have to actually do so before the offeree technically posts the letter. So in other words, going back to that example, if I'm the one making the offer and I'm based in Cape Town and I change my mind, I don't want to sell the car anymore, I have to actually communicate the fact that I have revoked my offer and changed my mind before that other person actually posts the fact that he or she has accepted my offer. If I do not revoke it before then the offer has been accepted and is now enforceable against me. Okay. It's a very, so that's why all of this, the date, time, is critical. Because if you haven't, then it is enforceable. So, basically, when it comes to this entire thing in the information theory, acceptance occurs when the recipient then reads the letter, email, or fax. So that completes this entire equation. So if you have authorized some other form of communication, or you've created some other principle which actually gives people more of an opportunity of how and when it should be accepted, then you'll be bound by that. So in other words, you can vary the rules. Okay. When it comes to telephonic contracts, it will be at the time and the place where the offerer hears the acceptance. So once again, the information theory applies. When it comes to this thing of a pacta de contrahendo, what do you think that means? It's a rather awkward term. It basically means that you have a contract that actually allows for the conclusion of other contracts. So it's a contract to create contracts, or an understanding to create other agreements or understandings. So interesting thing about this is that you might, by an example, have an option in a particular contract when an offerer agrees to keep his or her office open for a particular or a specified period of time. Interestingly enough here, the general principle would be that an offerer can revoke any of these offers anytime before that particular person again accepts it. And if any of the parties or the two parties enter into a contract of option, it's irrevocable for a particular specified period. And an example would normally be that if you give someone a particular option, that it would be, for example, 6 months. Have you heard of the right of preemption? Or a preemptive right? No. Have you heard of a right of first refusal? Okay, how many of you are leasing property at the moment? 1, 2, okay. So you're renting property at the moment. If you look at your lease agreement, I don't know how much time you spent wading through all the contractual terms for fun. What we're talking about here with the right of preemption is what happens if you're staying in a particular place, be it a house, be it a flat, be it an apartment, doesn't matter where it is. And you like this place quite a great deal. So you actually have agreed that, built into your lease agreement, that the owner of that particular property should, if they ever decide that they want to sell their property, should actually make an offer to you first before making an offer to the general public. So putting it into practical terms, I'm renting a house from you. My monthly rental is 12,000 Rand a month. I've been staying there for the last 2 years. I'm now very settled. You're about to emigrate. You're going to go and live in Australia because you want to go and spend time with your grandkids. Okay, whatever the reason. So now you want to sell everything in South Africa because you're going to travel the world and that's what you're going to do with your retirement. If you have a preemptive clause in the contract, no matter what it is that you're actually going to sell that house for, say 3 million Rand, you have to make the offer of sale to me first, and I then have an offer of right of first refusal to say, no, it's not a good time for me, or 3 million Rand is more than I can afford right now. Thank you very much. Once I have refused it, then you can actually make the offer to the general public. So as you would normally see in any other advert. The interesting thing about it though is that you must make the offer for the same value. So it's got to be for 3 million. If you feel that after say a year of trying to sell this house and it's not selling, and you feel that you should lower the selling price, so now your asking price has gone from 3 to say 2.5 million. The preemptive clause means that you must then come back to me, offer the same property to me, but now at the new selling price of 2.5 million. If I then still refuse 2.5 million, then only can you sell the property at 2.5 million to the general public. So that's the power of a preemptive clause. And that's why we call it the right of first refusal.